In chapter 11, verses 1 to 14, you saw that the northern cities around Hatzor, north of the Sea of Galilee, are all lined up. And it says in verse 14 of chapter 11, all the spoil of these cities and the cattle the sons of Israel took as plunder, but they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them. They left no one who breathed. Now look at verse 15. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone that all the Lord had commanded Moses. I think that is Samuel's insertion to sort of summarize what you've been looking at, which is a long history of a series of battles. And there's a little bit of a recap in 11:16 to 23. And look at what it says. Thus Joshua took all the land, the hill country, all the Negev, the land of all that the land of Goshen, the lowland, the Arava, the hill country of Israel and its lowland, from Mount Halak that rises towards Seir, even as Baal Gad, the valley of Lebanon at the foot of Mount Hermon. He's basically describing from the south to the center to the north to this edge, the entire zone. And what he's saying is that Joshua covered that zone. It doesn't mean he kicked out every other ite. There were other ites besides Israelites still there. We're going to see them later. But this is a summary. He's not trying to say he did this, then he did this, then he's just sort of kind of closing it up and saying he took all this land. Joshua waged war, verse 18, a long time with all these kings. There was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel except for the Hivites living at Gibeon. They took them all in battle. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts to meet Israel in battle in order that he might utterly destroy them, that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Verse 21, then Joshua came at this time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country. Who are the Anakim? Yes, this is the descendants of the Nephilim. Anak means giant. Anakim is the giants. And you remember that where we had the Nephilim in Genesis 5, they were cut off once, but now they've reappeared. One of the answers for the bitter destruction of the people here was there was significant demonic presence here. And that's one of the things you have to bear in mind with Canaan, that every time they would leave somebody live, they would open the door to allowing the demonic enemies to be a part of what was going on. And so it says in verse 22, there were no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod some remained. Would you make a note next to that? What are Anakim? What's it meaning? Giants. Who's going to come out of the giant territory? The land of Gaza, Gath, Ashdod, Ekron, that land is called what? Later on. It's the Philistine cities, the Philistine pentathlon. And coming from the Philistines will be a giant, Goliath, and giant brothers. And what I want you to understand is that's the last place the Anakim are. If the Anakim are in fact offspring of the Nephilim, and if in fact this is all, there's more going on with David and Goliath than just a tiny guy and a big guy. There is the God of Israel staring down someone who's directly involved in a demonic incursion in the race. So there's something much bigger. By the time you get to verse 23, you're supposed to sigh. Here's the sigh. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. Thus the land had rest from war. In my opinion, that's the end of the book. The end of the book is verse 23. You're supposed to go, God initiated a war. Israel maintained a war. The result, rest. You're supposed to walk away from chapter 11 going, after 5 chapters of warfare and killing, I just want it to be over. And you get to the end of the chapter and you go, it's over. Now, legal document number 1, right next to chapter 12, verse 1, legal document number 1, defeated kings. And this is a king's list. And no, we're not going to read it. No, we're not going to study it. No, we're not going to look for principles in a list of names of kings. Here's the principle. They lost. Okay? Let's move on. In chapter 13, next to 13:1, here's the legal document number 2. And this is basically the plotting of the land. It's laying out the land and dividing up the land. And you have in chapter 13 the directions under which each plot of land was taken up. And you can see it all the way through 13, very carefully specified as to which tribes got what. Verse 32, toward the end of the chapter, said, these are the territories which Moses apportioned for an inheritance. In other words, the division of the land in chapter 13 matches what God had told Moses to have them divide up the land way back in the middle of Numbers. Do you remember why God gave them the division all the way back in the middle of Numbers? They hadn't seen the land yet, and he was trying to encourage them after the spies went in and came out and the body bags and all the problems they had, that he wanted to encourage them that they were going to get the land. So the inheritance here, this is a legal document that simply is to say one thing. Somewhere next to chapter 13, put down, this shows that they obeyed the exact lines given by Moses in Numbers. That's all it's for. So Numbers made the promise. This is the delivery. Okay. Then there's a chapter, legal document number 3 is next to chapter 14. And legal document number 3 is the title of Hebron or Hebron. The title to Hebron. How did the city of Hebron get put in the hands of Caleb? And basically the story is singularly this. In chapter 14, Caleb says, look, I'm really old, but God said I was going to be able to come here and I was going to stand on this ground. And there's a piece of ground that I saw years ago, back when I was one of the spies in Numbers 13. And I made my way up to this piece of ground called Hebron. Can I have that piece of ground before I die for my children? I just would like somebody somewhere, as my kids grow up there, I'd like them to remember that this was the first view of the promised land our people had, and I stood on this ground long before them. Then I spent another 40 years making my way all the way around. Then we spent another 7 years conquering the land, and now nearly 50 years later, I just would like to have that. And at the end of chapter 14, it says, verse 13, so Joshua blessed him and gave Hebron to Caleb, son of Jephunneh, for an inheritance. Therefore, Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb and the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, unto this day, because he followed the Lord God of Israel fully. Now, the name of Hebron was formerly Kiryat Arba, which is actually the 4 villages. It means that Hebron was actually a place that started as small villages that ended up as a large city on top of a mountain. And even today, by the way, the city of Hebron is now the Palestinian city, and Kiryat Arba is the Jewish city. It's right next to it. Then the land had rest from war. I want you to underline at the end of verse 15, then the land had rest from war. He's emphasizing, he emphasized it 2 chapters ago. It's rest, it's rest, it's rest. And the reason is, when we get into Judges, you're going to find it's conflict, it's conflict. It's conflict, because compromise ends in conflict. Absolute obedience ends in rest. The further people go away from God's prescription for trouble, the more unrest develops. So in chapter 15, this will be legal document number 4. And this one is a very specific document to go over the territory that belonged to one specific tribe. See, because Judah is the first of the West Bank tribes to have its territory delineated. And the reason it is it's going to become an incredibly important tribe in the future. You know why. Not only will it be for David, but it'll also be there'll be a king on the throne of Judah. Judah becomes a very, very important tribe. At any rate, the borders and outlines of all of the southern part of the kingdom, the part that belongs to Judah, it's sort of this area right here. That area will be delineated first. Do you like how I do that? Now I can start undoing what I did before. Then you get into legal document number 6, and that's in chapter 16. 5 wasn't 5 Judah?
That was 4.
4? Okay, like I said, 5 is Ephraim, is the territory of Ephraim. And then 6 can be Manasseh in 17. And again, what you're looking at are very simple. First, by the way, they did Judah. Then they went to the sons of Joseph because of the rescue from Egypt. And then basically, when you get to chapter 18 and 19, and 18 and 19, it gives you the rest of the country and how it was divided. All these are fence markers. These are legal documents to tell you where the fences go. Which village falls under which tribe. Now, how important is it that they maintain the tribes and the fences where they belong? So it's so important that when girls married, remember this case? When girls married and they had land, how did they keep it from going to another tribe because they would marry somebody of another tribe?
They gave it to their relatives?
No, remember Moses said, everybody can marry anybody from any tribe except for if you're girls that are the only inheritors of it. Then you have to marry somebody within your tribe to keep the title of the property. That's how important the properties were. It was more important than that you could have, you needed to maintain the borders of that property. You blinked in a funny way. Was there a problem with that?
You just said the beginning of it confusing. That's why I'm like, wait.
Yeah, I deliberately did that. I wasn't trying to be super tricky, but I wanted you to see that it was so important that you really couldn't. The way that they solved it was that you couldn't. Okay, so 17, 18. Now you're all the way toward the end of the book. By the way, we're going to come up on some human stories pretty soon, and that's why we're brushing through these. Look, I could sit here and take apart every one of these, but you're not really going to want to know which villages. I did the geography of all these. It's wonderful and it's lots of fun, but if you don't know the geography of the land, you're going to sit here and go, why are we marking maps all over the place? Which is exciting if you live there, but not so much if you've never been there. The important thing is this. All of the tribal territories have legal documents supporting the claim for exactly, these are the legal library of what supports my claim of, no, wait a minute, I belong to this tribe, I was born here. Remember, they're not putting up actual fences. So somebody has to say, from this tree to that tree, those 2 villages are in this one, but that village is in that one. And that's what this does. When you get to 20, go ahead.
Okay, how big would a territory be?
They're actually, part of the problem was that they're not all the same.
Okay.
And in fact, like Ephraim gets a huge chunk of land. Ephraim gets like a big piece of this right here.
Like, is it just like proportionate to size, like the people?
Actually, this is the problem. It looks like, well, Ephraim says, we want more because we've been very blessed with people. But remember, this was done before they were that, back under Moses. Okay. So it's as though, and by the way, nothing was crowded. I mean, if you look at population figures, they would have been roughly equal to Highlands County. Okay. There's a lot of space here. I mean, we have towns, but then there's nothing between them. Mm-hmm. And, orange groves. There's actually a good bit of space. These villages are tent camp villages that become, remember, in Samuel, when everyone went home, they went home to their tents. In Kings, some went home to their tents, some went home to their houses. Okay? It doesn't become houses until later. And so for much of the biblical period, before the fall of the northern kingdom, before 722, we still have whole villages that are largely tent villages. By the way, tents don't work very well in Israel because it gets too much rain. They rot. And so the villages to the east, where the dry part of the country is, maintain tents longer than the ones on the west. When you go there today, you'll see all the people that live in tents live on the east side. That's just because if you live on the west side and you live in a tent, you pretty much are going to be, it's going to be mold. You're going to lose your tent every 3rd year, and tents are expensive. If you're going to lose it every 3rd year, you might as well put a block house up, and that's what they end up doing. So they're divine. They're actually divinely appointed by God through Moses, regardless of their size. Dan, for instance. Dan is not a huge tribe. It's a relatively small tribe. But Dan is the one tribe. I want you to go to 1940 for a minute. 1940 to 49. Dan gets a little piece of territory. It's right here. It's just a little piece of territory, and they don't hold it. You know where the tribe of Dan ends up? Here. That's where they were given the land. That's where they ended up with it. Why? Because they could stop Israelites from taking their property. What they couldn't do was stop Philistines from taking it. And Dan was too weak to hold it. So they ended up going and finding a city all the way up north whose name was Dan, and they were strong enough to conquer one city and take it. So that entire tribe only got one little valley and one little city way up north. But that's why there's two places for Dan. There's what Dan was told to get, and they still don't have it. It's now part of the Gaza Strip. And it's and what's up in the north. Okay. Actually, that's not true. It's not in the Gaza Strip, but it's next to it. Okay, let's go to chapter 20.
Okay,
That's
so
all right.
Where were the Philistine cities? Where were they? Were they
Okay, all the Philistine cities there's a pentathlon. There's 5 cities of the Philistines. Okay, Gaza, Gath, Ekron, Ashkelon, Ashdod. Those are your 5. Okay, all of them are in this part of the country. And today, Gaza obviously is in the Gaza Strip. Ashdod and Ashkelon are in Israel, but they're near the Gaza Strip. When Gaza fires rockets, they fall in Ashdod and Ashkelon. The cities today aren't exactly where the ancient cities were. They're usually next to them. You'll see a big tell sticking up, and that's the archaeological ruin, and here's this modern city. And they're sitting right next to each other. And so they fire these rockets into what essentially was ancient Philistine cities. We have 2 or 3 archaeologists who really got excited about Philistines. And they do a lot of digging. But for years, the Israelites weren't really worried about, Israelis weren't worried about digging up Philistine cities. They wanted to get their own ancestors before they got the other people's ancestors. And so Philistine archaeology is a relatively late thing. Who are the Philistines? I did tell you this. I'm just not sure if you remember it. There were 3 tribes of people that come from Greece. Their names were Tejeker, Sheridan, and Pelest. The Pelest are the biggest tribe. They become what we know as Philistines. These are Greeks. Beware of Greeks bearing gifts. They never go home. So they showed up on the beach and they stayed there. These are seafaring people. And they have better technology than Israel has. Why? Because they come from Greece and they have better swords and they have iron technology before Israel does. Israel's still using weaker metals when they have iron. So what happens is in the period of the Judges, Israel has to go to the Philistines to get their blades sharpened because they have better technology. Okay? It's the only reason. The Philistines could afford to stay there and be outnumbered and outmanned and outgunned because they had better weapons.
What year would they have showed up in this area? Good idea.
It's a little bit difficult for us to tell you that. It's sometime fairly close to when Israel shows up. They made a breach. Probably what happens, I'll give you the prevailing theory. If you go to the Aegean Sea and you visit Santorini, which, by the way, you should do before you die. Santorini is a gorgeous, half an island. The other half got blown off into the sea. And what happened was a huge volcano, the largest volcanic eruption in antiquity that we know of during historical period, was about 1500 BC. This huge blowing of this thing caused the fall of the Minoan civilization in Crete. And Greeks began to spread out. We think of Greeks as great colonizers. They weren't just colonizers because they wanted to, it's that their home got blown up. By the way, probably the Atlantis, the Homeric myth of Atlantis comes from this. Because an entire civilization sunk into the sea overnight. So that, does discourage people. At any rate, so they made their way across the Mediterranean and they ended up in a couple of places. One of the places they went was Cyprus. Another one they went was into Egypt. But when they arrived in Egypt, Pharaoh came out to meet them with an army and pushed them off the beach. This happens in several waves, but eventually they end up on the southwest corner of what is now Israel. and they make their way there and they settle over the time. You have to remember, after Pharaoh was humbled by the God of Abraham, it meant he wasn't strong enough to stop incursions on his own territory, and that beach was his territory. So the Philistines come in as a result of the Exodus, in my view, and they begin to settle there.
The Israelites wiped them out with everyone else.
Technology. The Israelites, when you take, if you walk into a sword fight and you have a bronze sword and he has an iron one, he'll cut yours in half. It's really discouraging when your swords fall in half. You know, I mean, seriously, it's almost comical if it wasn't so sad. So the Israelites will chase the Canaanites all the way down to the edge of the Philistine territory and then stop. Why? Because if they keep going, there'll be a sword fight and then their swords will all get broken and they come home with half the sword. They're not going to come home. But you know what I'm saying.
Did God say to remove everyone?
What's that?
Didn't God say remove everyone?
Yes.
So why did God allow the Philistines to be there?
This is one of those why God does what God does questions.
Yeah.
What do I do with those questions?
That's what he said.
Yeah, the Bible isn't written to tell you why God does what he does. The Bible's only written to tell you what you're supposed to do. There's so many things I would like to ask why God does what he does. I will tell you that the Philistines also represent at this point some of the demonic incursion. So you have Anakim living amongst the Philistines. And what I'm saying by that is not that God, it's out of God's control. I'm saying there's another enemy here. And there's two things going on here, not one. Okay? All right, when we get down to chapter 20, I want you to notice, do you remember what the cities of refuge were? This was, they distributed the land to the tribes, and the next administrative regulation was to provide an elementary system of government, right? And one of the things they had to do was provide for these cities of refuge. What was a city of refuge for?
Accidental killing.
Okay, or at least your claim that it was a manslaughter case, right? And so then they set up the manslaughter. Now, I want you to look at verse 6, 20 verse 6. He shall dwell in that city until he stands before the congregation for judgment. These were supposed to be temporary housing until they stood before judgment. But then look, then the manslayer shall return to his own city and to his own house, to the city from which he fled. Only if adjudicated that it was okay. If he was guilty, he would be held in that city until what time? When could he go back home? When the next high priest dies. And so that's why at the end of this record, there'll be the death of a high priest. Whenever a high priest dies, everybody can empty the cities of refuge and go back home. And as a result, this is one of the great parts of their regulation. Now, you can find more where on the cities of refuge. Does anybody know? It is end of Numbers. You want Numbers 35 or you want Leviticus 24? Those are the two places I would write next to chapter 20. Leviticus 24, Numbers 35. And this was the retribution laws. Remember what retribution laws are? Out of out of Leviticus 24 and Numbers 35, we get eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. In other words, that the punishment should balance against the crime. By the way, those were not originally found in the words of Moses. Does anybody know where an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth originally was seen in human history? It comes from the Code of Hammurabi. It comes from the ancient Assyrian, and the actual words eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth show up in that legal document. So that when God said something, don't let that bother you. Remember that people all over the earth at one time had an attachment to God. And at one time, there was a latent amount of information still left in their culture. So for instance, if I tell you that there were these Anakim, these giants, and that they were demonic incursion in the race, and there was a battle against them, and you grow up in Greece and call them Titans, that's a leftover of something that happened. So you have mythology, but mythology often grew out of things that actually occurred. And so sometimes you have to look at the mythological world and try to say, does any of this actually make sense? You remember the goat demon? We were talking about them worshiping the goat demon, and then you go to the mythology of these satyrs, and it's the same story. Okay? So that's one of the reasons in the Torah you get some of the richness of that. All right, let's go to chapter 21. I'm pushing through here just to get us to the human stories because those are the ones that really will get you excited. I can just see that you're ready to be excited. Chapter 21 is actually a document that is a testimony to God's faithfulness. That's what it's intended to be. So 48 cities of the Levites, mark somewhere, 48 cities of Levites are outlined in chapter 21. And those 48 cities get you all the way down to verse 43, where you see the testimony to God's faithfulness. So the Lord gave Israel all the land which he had sworn to give their fathers, and they possessed it and lived in it. And the Lord gave them rest. There it is again. This is the fourth time I'm seeing, and they got rest. He gave them rest on every side according to all that he had sworn to their fathers, and no one of all their enemies stood before them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hand. Not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. Now here's the thing. He's not telling you everybody died that was a Canaanite. That's clearly not the case. What he's telling you is every time they went out to fight, they obeyed God and they won. And then they got a rest that came out of that.